The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together, without coercion or conscription, bullying or bossiness.
Always whenever someone says, oh, peace and sausage, and it's a roll and sausage, and it's sausage roll, we're better together.
Well, they didn't. It was us. We invented it, just like every other bloody thing.
Well, that's very interesting.
We have very serious the referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hi, if you've been fed up with most of the debate until now, the Scottish Independence Podcast is your chance to hear some different views on what the independence referendum means for Scotland. Hello, I'm Michael Greenwell, and this is the first Scottish Independence Podcast. We're going to try to do this every fortnight in the run-up to the independence referendum, but we may have some more frequent ones depending on what comes up. For this first one, I went down to Cambridge to speak to Donald Adamson, who's originally from Edinburgh but now teaches political economy at Cambridge and social science at the Open University. He writes for the Scottish Left Review and also, like me, for Bella Caledonia. In fact, there's going to be a part 2 to this podcast, but there'll be a couple of other ones in between, notably Andrew Tickle, or Lyland's Pete Warrior, who you may know him as, who will be on next time. So we should just go to the conversation, and I'll have a wee word with you at the end. Okay, bye-bye. So I'm here with Donald Adamson in Cambridge University. He teaches political economy here at the university, and he also writes for Bella Caledonia and some other publications. Donald, it started in 1707. Do you think the Union's reaching the end of its trial period now?
I think it's already past that phase. One of the things I think that's interesting about what's been happening in the last 3 or 4 decades, I mean, I've been a supporter of independence since I can time it to the very year, 1973. And one of the things I think that's been happening in the last 3 or 4 decades, particularly in the Scottish left, is that there's been increasing disaffection with Britishness, particularly with the undemocratic practices and institutions of the British state and British capitalism. But I think you have to appreciate also that there's a huge constituency in Scotland that's still very loyal to the British state and to the idea of Britishness.
Do you think that's a generational thing? Like, for example, in my family, everyone of my generation, basically almost everyone is an independence supporter, whereas the kind of wartime generation are less independent supporting, but maybe the generations before the wartime there was more kind of independence and militancy in terms of independence.
Yeah, I mean, I think the post-war settlement and the settlement that was established by that first Attlee government in 1945, or the first 2 Attlee governments, 45 to 51, the second one only lasted about a year, was very important. I think it cemented ideas and concepts and institutions like the welfare state, which clearly are very important in Scotland. And I think the ideology of that clearly informs the Labour Party, Scottish Labour Party, who exercise a great deal of influence in Scottish politics and have done throughout the post-war period. But to get back to your earlier question about the trial of the Union, I think the Union is past its sell-by date, but there's an awful lot of reasons for that, and there's an awful lot of underlying explanations for that. My own interest, as I've already indicated, is in the fortunes of the Scottish left. And one of the things that I think needs to be kind of fully accommodated and fully understood by the left in Scotland is the growing importance of British economic imperialism. For example, when the Scottish left makes its critique of British imperialism, it understandably addresses issues like British military adventurism, British foreign policy, the wars and death and destruction that the British have waged and continue to wage on countries across the world, and of course British weapons of mass destruction. Those things are important, and of course they're critically important, and they're the most obvious manifestations of British imperialism. But I think underlying that is a British economic imperialism that needs to be more fully understood by the left. And there are a number of ways of looking at this. I mean, one of the ways that I like to look at it is to look at the balance of British investments and the balance between British assets and liabilities in international investment. And one of the most notable things that's been happening since 1995, and this has been accelerating since 1997 when New Labour came into power, is that British liabilities, that is the capital that overseas holders hold in the City of London largely, has been larger than the assets that Britain holds, again channelled through the City of London, in other countries in the world.
So there's a specific article about something related to that, but I was wondering what you thought about it. Have you read the famous article by Niall Aslan about the Great Deception?
Yeah.
And this extra regio country that they've created
Yes.
To funnel the money through?
Yeah.
Would you be able to talk about that a bit more?
Well, I have to say I'm much more interested, not that what Niall says isn't interesting, I'm much more interested in taking a more Marxist approach and much more influenced by the work of people like Robert Northfield at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, and Kostas Lapavitsas, a Marxist economist. And one of the issues that they've raised is that this issue about the net deficit in British investments, because it equips and underpins Britain's ability to pursue this military adventurism, to deploy these weapons of mass destruction, to pursue its foreign policy. For example, in 2010, the value of British assets or British liabilities was £250 billion larger than British assets. We also have to remember that every year since 1981, the British have been running a deficit in their visible trade balance. And I think one of the things the Scottish Life needs to ask is, how have the British managed this? How have they managed to pull this off, these twin deficits, for so long? Deficits that would have crippled most other national economies, with the obvious exception of the US. And the answer to that is that the British earn much higher returns from their assets than they pay out in their liabilities, held again in the City of London. And although it's true that some 80% of British assets are held in Europe and North America, where the returns are quite low, the real returns that the British earn from their assets in regions like Asia, Africa, the Middle East and Latin America. And of course the question is, why do the British do this? And how does this increase Britain's earnings on or British capital's earnings on its net investments? And the answer is there's a plentiful supply of cheap labour in these regions of the world that allows the British to earn more than double the return from their investments in these regions, Asia, Africa, the Middle East and Latin America, than they do in their assets from Europe and North America.
So it's an update of the exploitation project of the empire?
Basically, it's a second British Empire. The first British Empire obviously started to collapse from in the 1950s and 1960s, in the decades after the Second World War.
And how would Scottish independence change that?
Well, this is something I do feel that the left does need to engage with. And actually, I think the Scottish left is engaging with this, because one of the great appeals of Scottish independence is that we'd allow Scotland to disengage from what is this second wave of British imperialism, British economic imperialism, which is based on the exploitation of the poorest workers in the world. Whether we like it or not, that makes us, as long as we're part of the British state, that makes us accomplices to
And what do you think about the historical argument? Because very often if Scottish people complain about the British Empire in the past, you get kind of 2 points. One, a kind of fervent independence supporter would say, well, we were the first colonised country, but a unionist would then turn around and say, well, the Scots have been complicit in all the crimes of the British Empire.
Yeah, I think the latter is an argument that Tom Devine quite rightly puts. But of course what you have to remember as well, it was largely Scotland's ruling classes that benefited from the empire. And whilst Scotland's ruling classes were benefiting from the empire, they were exploiting Scotland's workers in Scotland. The appalling conditions that workers were working under in all kinds of industries and sectors of the economy. So yes, I think Tom Devine is right to make this point. It's a fair point, but now that we're aware, or now that we should be more aware of what the British are doing with their British economic imperialism, there's no excuse anymore for Scotland not to disengage from its association with this, because it's this British economic imperialism that supports British military inventionism, British weapons of mass destruction, and its foreign policy. So I think the original point we'd hold is it's a substantive point, but again I would look at this from a Marxist perspective, and the point I made earlier about it was largely Scotland's ruling classes that benefited from the empire, and again it's largely Scotland's ruling classes that are benefiting from the Second British Empire, from British economic imperialism. So yeah, that would be part of my part of my answer to that question.
Okay, and the idea with when I said at the start our trial period, it was partly as a joke, but partly not, because the part of the unionist response to this has been threats is the standard one, but there's also been lots of kind of promises of tinkering. It's not the union that's broken, we just need to change this constitutional settlement a bit. So on the more constitutional side of it, what do you think is going on at the moment? What's in play?
Well, I think what's in play is the British are increasingly having, and the apologists of the British in Scotland are increasingly having to take defensive positions. And if you think about the pace of change in Scotland since 1999, it's been remarkable. We've not only seen kind of first generation devolution, we've seen Calman, and even before Calman is bedded in to the legislative process, even before it's properly operational, unionists are already talking about a new settlement. That's astonishing when you think that the Labour Party, the original Scottish Labour Party, had Home Rule as one of its foundational aims in the late 19th century. And we had to wait a whole century, over 100 years, for Labour to implement that. And yet in the space of little more than a decade, we've gone from first to second, now to third generation devolution. But I think there's a lot more at stake here, obviously. It's because I think one of the important issues that kind of strikes me, particularly from a lot of people who are either in the No campaign or have already expressed their intention to vote No in 2014, is that they seem to have kind of short-term time horizons. They seem to be afflicted with the British disease of short-termism. I mean, the British state and British capital has been in crisis for over 40 years now. Clearly it's in crisis now, but there's nothing new about crisis. Anyone who's read Marx or Keynes will be familiar with the notion of capitalism, or the periodic crises of capitalism, and why they occur. And I think this is to get back to the point where we kind of touched on earlier about the breakdown of the first British Empire in the decades after the Second World War. I think that created huge problems for the British, because you have to remember the Empire gave the British huge privileges, access to cheap raw materials, cheap labour. The sterling area created a plentiful demand for dollars across the world. And of course, once the sterling area ended, and once the British Empire ended, and particularly once Bretton Woods collapsed in 1971, British capital, particularly British industrial capital, was fully exposed to international competition from capital overseas. And British capital was found wanting. And it's this deficit and this inability of the British, particularly industrial capital, to maintain the extraction of surplus value that it had previously extracted from workers in Britain, and of course the British Empire, that in many ways explains the earlier turn to neoliberalism and financialisation rather, of the British state. And I'd say this crisis really began in Britain earlier in the late 1960s. And of course, every British government since the 1950s has tried to address this. The Tories tried to address it in the 1950s with corporatism, or quasi-corporatism, the peculiar variant of corporatism that the British tried to implement in the 50s and 60s. Wilson tried to reverse the fortunes of British industrial capital in the 1960s. He failed. Heath failed. The Heath government failed in the early 1970s. The Callaghan government failed. The Thatcher governments clearly failed. The Major government failed. The Blair governments failed. The Brown government failed. And